We are in the midst of a season of dramatic change, both in the world and in the life of the church. It isn't just one, but many factors are changing our world, the role of religion in the midst of society, secularization, technology changing the ways we connect, lack of trust in institutions, and more have shifted things and displaced religious organizations and the church in particular from places of public prominence and power to somewhere closer to the edges. What has been moving fast enough for decades now was accelerated even more since the pandemic made us rethink just about everything that we do, including the ways that we connect with one another. By the way, hi again to those who are joining with us virtually. The changes haven't all been bad, and not all of it good either. But no question, things have changed. Give me a moment there. Okay. Indeed, this is a time of great change, and for some who get uncomfortable when everything is too comfortable, that's just fine. We welcome that. But for many who remember and thrived in the glory of the past, it can be painful to take stock of just how much the world has changed and is changing. In Isaiah's day, it was the distant memory of David's kingdom that had been lost to the pages of history. Israel's autonomy was gone. Foreign rulers called the shots, and God's people were left longing for what once was. If Israel was once a glorious tree, by the time of Isaiah 11, as we have heard, the tree was little more than a stump. For some among us, the memories of days gone by can leave an empty spot in the heart too. With a place that has a history like this church, you've seen some things, been through some things, and you know that there was something very good about the glory days of the past. Some of you in this room and joining with us online can remember days gone by when this sanctuary was full 2 times every Sunday. You may remember some of the initiatives and the trips that huge youth choirs took. You might remember the pictures that showed the size of confirmation classes, as well as the names of people like the Armstrongs, Jackson Burns, on and on. We're wise to listen to the prophet Isaiah, because for people who knew what once was and what is, Isaiah's vision is a hopeful one. Even for those who had the memory of the once glorious tree, now stump, Isaiah had hopeful words. But to be true, Isaiah didn't cover it up. Instead, he invited the people to face and remember what had been, and also to take stock of what had become. However, as I said, in the midst of doing that remembering work, Isaiah's vision is ultimately hopeful. For what appears to be a lifeless stump, Isaiah says, will spring forth a new shoot. A new branch will grow in the place where the people found nothing but endings and unfulfilled desires. The glory of the former tree, as Isaiah has it, would pale in comparison to what was still ahead. Of course, as we look back and read Isaiah's hopeful word, we recognize Jesus as that shoot that emerged from the stump of Jesse or David's family line. As we've heard from Luke, even as a child, when Jesus stayed back as his family's caravan left Jerusalem, the child was found lingering in the temple, listening, asking questions, providing new thoughts that would impress and confound those who heard. We know as Jesus grew up, as he grew in favor and stature, he would continue to rework the old traditions. He would continue to provide new insight, continue to reframe the teachings, and he did it all with a kind of authority that made the good news he had to share happen. I would suggest that Isaiah's hopeful vision and the young Jesus in the temple have something to tell us about our own place in the midst of a world that is changing, in the midst of a church that is changing as well. We're wise, like Isaiah had it, to remember the past glory and to also remain hopeful that God still does new things in the world. I'd suggest that for us to be intentionally intergenerational is the best way that we can hold both of those facets together, to hold on to a faithful memory and a faithful hope. For if we can only remember what once was, we're only going to find stumps. Wherever we look, just another stump, just another stump. But if we will disregard what has been and go searching for novelty all over the place, we will never realize what Isaiah knew, that the new shoot emerges from the stump that has deep roots. To be intergenerational is to be a community where stories from young and old have a place to be shared, honored, and nurtured. We need to hear from those who know about the days gone by, and we need to hear from those who are trying to write some new stories among us right now. Speaking of right now, I suppose I should say something about the General Conference that we're in the middle of as well. I realize if some of you have been surprised that General Conference is happening, that's probably my fault. I've been reluctant to say much about General Conference outside of putting a few things in the Outlook. And I've had to do a little bit of soul searching to figure out why that's been the case. I'm not sure I entirely know my answer, but I know a piece of it is that I've been awfully disappointed and hurt by the way that our denomination has hurt and abandoned so many people in the past, including friends of mine. There have been moments when I've invested so much hope only to see our church, which is supposed to be full of people who understand what grace is all about, instead double down on punitive measures that further alienate those who had already been pushed to the margins. It was just a little over 5 years ago that I stood in this pulpit waving the Book of Discipline around like an angry person. I didn't want to linger on what looked like a stump to me. However, as 1 week of General Conference has ended, and maybe you've seen some of this in the national news, it appears that new life might even be emerging from one of the most surprising of places, the United Methodist Church's General Conference. I'm cautious, yet I'm hopeful, as this week steps were taken towards regionalizing the UMC, or at least the Church in America, which would allow the church to hold the bonds of global unity while also freeing up the church in the United States, giving us a bit of room to be the church that God is calling us to be here and now. General Conference voted in the course of the last few days on revised social principles. Melanie's taught on some of those social principles. before they were approved. But they've been approved, pieces of it at least. A significant piece of that was an element that, let me try to restate that. They removed a section of the social principles, reworked a section that called LGBTQ people's lives and loves incompatible with Christian teaching, in a statement that was supposed to be affirming the sacred worth of all God's children. 90%, I think, or north of 90% approved a revised social principles that no longer has that incompatibility language in it. There is certainly work to do, and that's not the only part of our book of discipline that needs some fresh eyes, and there's still a week ahead of work to come. But the reports out of Charlotte this week have been surprisingly hopeful. The thing I keep hearing from people who are there is that a new church is emerging. Dare I say that stumps can still bear forth new shoots? Again, I'm still cautious, because improving the legislation doesn't undo the harm that so many people have experienced. But it seems that a new kind of life, of mission and vision, is starting to emerge among the United Methodist Church. It seems like we are starting to remember who we were called to be from the beginning. That is, we're looking back and remembering a good past. But we're not trying to recreate that past anymore. We're seeking to be a faithful church in a world that has changed. A good past and a good future. As a part of this congregation, I would like to believe that we're trying to do those same sorts of things, of holding to the goodness of the past and writing a good new future too. I'm so grateful for our history team. I'm looking at Jade and Jan, and I know my Uncle John has been working with that team as well, and whoever else I'm forgetting, my apologies. I appreciate the work that they are doing in that space. Well, there's some contractors working in that space, but just beyond those loge windows, there's some good work going on to make sure that our past is accessible to us as a congregation. But I'm also cautious with that as well. If Jade and Jan and John and Dave up there and all those do all of this good work simply so that we can lament what has been in the past, we'll only have a stump to sit on as we rest our surely weary bodies. But if we are willing to couple memory with new hope, we will see what happens among people who are rooted in a faith that keeps lifting up the shoots that spring forth from old stumps. And it's at that point that we're ready to imagine what is possible here and now. To remember our past rightly and to live with hope for the future calls us to invest in the present. And that means to find the wisdom and the energy that is shared across generations among us. As I said a few weeks ago, on a broad level, being an intergenerational church can be quite challenging. All the articles will tell you that. It's a culture shift, even. However, I would suggest to take the first steps doesn't require a culture shift. It requires the smallest bit of intention. It entails showing up, talking to someone who's from another generation than yourself. To show up at an intergenerational event that we've hosted several. We've got another one coming up next Sunday morning. I have to say, I was moved to tears in the blessing that Pastor Julie shared this morning. those who are in the early stages of retirement, at least one of you shared the sorrow that you feel from being blamed for the way the world is. That's heavy. But to also know that you hold out hope that the next generation will fix some things and see things that you couldn't see. I needed to hear that. I suspect there are some others in this room who needed to hear that. When we shared a blessing from our youth, I hope you heard some of the stories that flow out of a desire to survive. Young people among us are thinking about the end of the world. What are we as a faith community going to do with that? We need to hear one another. And I believe that this can be a place where we can listen and take seriously the things that come from someone who is of another generation than our own. It's interesting, in our gospel lesson, when Mary and Joseph made their way back to Jerusalem, they finally found the child Jesus in the temple. They obviously were not happy. And they didn't fully understand why Jesus was there. And yet, I'm always taken when I read this passage because Mary held these things. She treasured them in her heart. That's the kind of openness, curiosity, hopefulness for the good things that God can still do among us. Even among a people who may think the tree's been lost to history and all that is there is a stump. The thing about stumps, though, is that no matter what has been cut off above the dirt, it can't remove the deep roots under. And in God's patience and God's power, the things that we might see as lifeless are still places from which new life springs forth. Some will pay attention and recognize God's new thing. Others will not. What will we do? Amen.